Hi, this is Jack Stanley, and I wanted to talk about a newspaper that was very prevalent in the early part of the history of this country. In fact, it was the first in the order of what you might call the opposition press. It was called the American Aurora, or General Advertiser, founded by Benjamin Franklin Bach, or Bach, whichever way you like to pronounce it. There were several different ways of saying it, and William Duane, and the newspaper was started in 1794. Now, let me explain who Benjamin Franklin Bach was. He was Benjamin Franklin's grandson. And the thing is that Benjamin Franklin, of course, was a printer, and his grandson had a great deal of interest in printing. Also went with his grandfather on trips to Europe, as a matter of fact. So he was a very well-versed individual and knew a lot about France. And, of course, in the 1790s, when the newspaper started, there was a lot of activity taking place in France, and there was a lot of activity here in the United States concerning the revolution taking place in France. And of course, we took a neutral posture. That was the decision of the Washington administration. Now, the American Aurora was a very partisan paper. It was a Republican paper, basically, for all intents and purposes. Pro-France, all that stuff like that. And it was very anti-Federalist. So it was not at all fond of George Washington, and they hated John Adams. Now, the thing is that they wrote frightening and horrible things, and not always very true things about John Adams or George Washington, or maybe even Alexander Hamilton, and anybody else who was a Federalist. It got so that in 1798, John Adams instituted the Alien and Sedition Acts, which meant that you could not write or present things that were against the government or against the current presidency. And of course, the American Aurora did, and its editors were jailed. And Benjamin Franklin Bach died in jail during a yellow fever epidemic. Now, I want to give you an example of the American Aurora. This is an example from, what's the date here? December 13th, 1805. Now, this is a few years after Benjamin Franklin Bach's death, but if you look at the header, it'll mention William Duane and then the successor to Benjamin Franklin Bach, and printed in Franklin Court. Now, the interesting thing about this is a fascinating newspaper. Very hard to find today, copies of it. But what's really important about it is the fact that that was the first of the opposition press. I mean, serious opposition press. And of course, its editor died in prison. Fascinating book was written about it many years ago in the late 20th century, called The American Aurora. And as you can see here, it says some of the various things that were stated. So it was somewhat incendiary in their writing, but a very, very important part of the history of journalism and the beginnings of what we might call the opposition press. One last thing to mention, my nephew is very involved in a organization that goes against corruption and things like that, and they write about it. They do press releases, and so I took him to the offices of where the American Aurora was, and I said, this is where it all began. This is your forebears. Pretty fascinating how the world just keeps going around and around, and what is old is new, and what is new is often old.